one of the things now is that we're getting towards where I'd like to start focusing on some things that you might give insight to our audience on what we might be able to do to more fully optimize our circadian system's function. So I know one of the things you mentioned briefly towards the beginning was this idea of blue light and how in the morning blue light's really important. It helps really what I would think of as our alerting circadian system. But at night, blue light could be detrimental. So could you talk a little bit about that and strategies that might help mitigate blue light at night?
Yeah, so I suppose I should just preempt this by saying that the same things that you can do to improve the function of your body clock will also improve your sleep. And I think people often focus on the nighttime stuff and they ignore the daytime stuff. So during the day, if you're physically active, especially outside, then you're going to help anchor your circadian rhythm. And we can speak about light boxes and that kind of thing, but I do think that if it's at all possible, just doing things like getting outside for half an hour during your lunch break is going to be such a good thing for many reasons too. I think if I just continue down that route, then you want to try and make sure that if you're doing stressful tasks, you do them earlier in your day too, because if you do them too late, then that could interfere with your ability to fall asleep at night. I think likewise, if you're going to do strenuous exercise, then you probably don't want to do that too late. So I'd cut that by 3 hours before bedtime. And then I'd also generally avoid napping too late in the day, probably in the sort of 7 hours or so before bedtime. And then going back to light before bed, I think what you typically see is that your body will start producing melatonin roughly 2 hours before your normal bedtime. So that's the time for you to start dimming the lights and engaging in what you might call a digital sunset too. So you might, for example, use apps on your phone and on your computer. So if your computer, you can use f.lux. If you've got an iPhone, you can use night shift mode. If you've got an Android phone, you can use twilight. And you can also dim the brightness settings on all of those things. In your bedroom, I recommend that you remove anything that emits blue light if possible. So if you must have an alarm clock that does emit light, then you'd want one that emits red light, because that has a much smaller effect on your body's production of melatonin. And I think it's also just important to keep your bedroom relatively clutter-free and as stress-free as possible. You want it to be cool, because if anything, you want your body temperature to drop as you start to fall asleep, and that will therefore be pulling your body in the right direction. But perhaps counterintuitively, shortly before bed, you actually want to raise your skin temperature, because when you do so, you basically encourage the heat from deep within your body in its core to be drawn towards its extremities. And it's especially important to heat up your hands and your feet, because they've got a big surface area and a small volume, which means that you can gain or lose heat through them very quickly. So that's important too. And then I think generally our lives now are often full of stress. So things that you can do to reduce that in the build up to sleep are very important. So do something relaxing the last half hour or so before bedtime. One thing that's been studied recently, which is very interesting, is making a to-do list for the next few days shortly before bedtime. If you do that, then you basically unload things that might otherwise stay in the back of your mind as you're trying to fall asleep. And what they found is that when people did that, they fell asleep faster. And interestingly, people who listed more things and in greater detail tended to experience that effect to a greater extent too. So I think that's probably a useful tip as well.
Welcome to the Collective Insights podcast, where we explore topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Dr. Greg Potter, an expert on circadian rhythms, how they interact with nutrition, and how they interact with sleep, joins our own Dr. Greg Kelly for this episode. Today, we'll be discussing circadian rhythms and why they're important to our health. Make sure to subscribe to Collective Insights wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode.